Corey T is watching now. Glad he's back, though, as we're going to watch a burn mirror.
And did we have Tyler Winn on camera in Cincinnati last week?
He was not with us in Cincinnati last week. Tyler Winn we did have on camera. Yes.
Yeah.
He played against Adam Yurchik and lost.
Correct. Okay, that's where I remember him from.
Both players starting off here with just some red sources of mana. Wilkerson has actually 2 copies of Chain of the Rocks in his hand. Looks like, but nothing to do with them. Here's an Eidolon of the Great Revel.
This was the big change or addition that Tyler Winn made to the deck last week in Cincinnati. A little harrowing in the mirror match here, but Wilkerson does have to remove it with a shock.
Yeah, he's going to deal 2 to that, so Wilkerson's going to end up taking 2. So it's 18 for Tyler Wilkerson. Tyler Winn sitting at 20. Wilkerson does not have a 3rd land, just has to pass the turn back. Actually drew a Searing Blood for the turn. That's a little bit ironic, as you're going to see Wilkerson probably fire off a burn spell. Burn mirrors. What exactly is the game plan?
The biggest card is War Leader's Helix. You want to try to resolve that card when your opponent is tapped out. That's the big trick, because Skullcrack can muck it up. So other than that, it's, trying to be efficient with your mana. Make sure that you aren't playing into potential Searing Bloods. And again, just try to resolve War Leader's Helix into an opponent that does not have the mana to Skullcrack you back.
Magma Jet there from Winn. He's going to play his 4th land, which is a Mutavault, before passing the turn back. Wilkerson probably has to be a little bit scared of War Leader's Helix right now, as you did mention, but there's really also not a lot that he can do about it.
Not much to be done. And Wilkerson's hand is so bad right now. 2 copies of Chain of the Rocks with no white mana, a Searing Blood where it's not clear if Winn's going to produce another target for the rest of the game. It's not clear he has the luxury of trying to play around Helix here.
Yeah, he's going to fire off a Magma Jet, and you see Winn is going to immediately fire off a War Leader's Helix in response to that. So Wilkerson's going to go down to 12. Winn's going to go up to 21 and then down to 19. So it's time for a little scry action, and you see Wilkerson looking at a Helix of his own and a Mutavault.
And that is an error on Winn's part. You want to wait until your opponent has resolved the scry, because the fact that you have War Leader's Helix potentially informs how they're scrying.
Mutavault and the Helix. It looks like Wilkerson wants to keep the War Leader's Helix, even though he doesn't have another land or white mana. That's exactly what he's going to do. He draws a Helix and just passes the turn back. How do we feel about that?
It's his only way to catch up. It looks bad, but there's no way he's catching up in this game without drawing really well from here. And the Helix gives him some shot of doing that.
Draws a copy of Lightning Strike, just passes the turn back. Tyler Winn with a copy of Boros Charm. We're going 4 damage mode. Tyler Wilkerson down to 8. See if Winn has anything else to do here. He's got some pretty free reign spells to cast. Looks like it's going to be Lightning Strike time. Wilkerson goes down to 5.
And Wilkerson just doesn't really have any ways to interact with this.
Looks like an Eidolon, a Great Revel. The draw here for Winn. He can cast that. And that'll cost Tyler Wilkerson to take 2 no matter what. So a real problem here for Wilkerson. He's going to have to cast Searing Blood, trigger. Wilkerson going to take 2, go down to 3. Winn likely to end up taking 3 from the Searing Blood. He's going to go down to 16, but Winn is very far ahead in this game.
Really hard to imagine Wilkerson being able to catch up here. He needs to draw untapped white mana next turn and somehow not die in all of this.
And Magma Jet setting the stage for things here as well. Seems pretty tough.
It's becoming less and less likely that Wilkerson can survive here.
Especially when your opponent keeps a card on top, which Winn does. He's going to cast the Magma Jet, and that is going to do it. So Tyler Winn is going to win game number 1 here over Tyler Wilkerson in the Tyler and Burn Mirror. We're going to head to sideboard, so we'll take a look at Wilkerson's first, which you do have in front of you.
4 copies of Fire Drinker Satyr, a Byzantium Mortars, 3 copies of Toil Trouble, a Chain of the Rocks, a Wear Tear, 2 Satyr Fire Dancers, a Faded Conflagration, and 2 Eidolon and the Great Revels. I believe 0 of these cards. Maybe Toil and Trouble.
Is there a game plan?
Not really. It's not. He can't really change what his deck does at core. He can bring in more creatures, but of course Winn can answer those pretty trivially. And he can't bring in more burn spells because they're all essentially here already. So there's not a lot to be done. He can bring in 3 copies of Toil and Trouble if he wants to. The creature removal is a little dodgy in the mirror match. There's not a lot to be killed. So you can get away from some of that stuff. 2 copies of Chain of the Rocks can pretty easily hit the bench, but there's not a lot to bring in.
On Winn's side of things, he has 4 Fire Drinker Satyrs, 2 Satyr Fire Dancers, 2 Wear Tear, 2 Active Treason, 2 Chain of the Rocks, and a Dictate of the Twin Gods. We've already seen that card once on camera. There's a chance for another. Do you like anything there? I kind of just go towards you. That's pretty much the same sideboard.
I also dislike all the cards in the sideboard for the mirror match. He may want to bring in the Fire Dancers, I guess, but there's not a lot to like here. Excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too surprising, right? We take a look at these burn sideboards. You know, they aren't gearing their sideboards or their decks to beat other burn decks because it's not a deck that sees a lot of play. So the burn mirror, you know, it kind of seems like it's kind of a crapshoot because neither player is really prepared for it. It's just whoever draws better or who finds more copies of War Leader's Helix.
It's sequencing of your spells that matters a lot, and yeah, making sure that you're not playing into their Skullcracks or their War Leader's Helix. But it's pretty straightforward Magic. It's not that hard to navigate the mirror match. There's also some spots where you have to respect Searing Blood and not run into it by animating Mutavaults or casting certain things at certain times, but there's not a lot of play to the mirror match.
Well, it certainly wasn't hard game one for Tyler Winn, disposing of Tyler Wilkerson very, very quickly with War Leader's Helix and Friends here. We talked a little bit earlier during the show just about our thoughts on Burn in general. Not a deck that we expect to see a lot of. Doesn't seem as though it's all that well positioned at this point, but both these players sitting at 4-0.
Good start so far for both of them. Yeah. Winn's list got a lot of interesting stuff going on in it. We've already commented both in this broadcast and the previous one about 4 midnight copies of Eidolon and the Great Revel. He's also playing 2 copies of Wild Guess.
A little surprised by that.
Yeah.
Haven't seen that card in some time. So the rest of it is pretty straightforward. You've got Chandra's Phoenix, Boros Charm, Skullcrack, War Leader's Helix, Magma Jet, Lightning Strike, a couple copies of Searing Blood, some Shocks, and then some Chain to the Rocks. And again, Dictator of the Twin Gods is a very unique effect that's starting to see a little bit of play here this weekend in Knoxville. One in the sideboard for Winn. We saw it a little bit earlier in Philip Fortner's take on this deck. It's a pretty volatile card, but when it's good, it's definitely great.
1 copy in the sideboard seems pretty high upside to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you said you haven't seen Wild Guess in a while, what duration of time do you mean by a while? Did you mean ever?
I did not mean ever, and I'll tell you why. Man, whenever Frites was, or Frites, or whatever people used to call that deck, the reanimation deck that the French played.
I think it's Frites.
Yeah, a while ago. Raphael Levy and friends played that deck. There was a version running around the Seattle PTQ scene that had Wild Guess. I think also Adam Boyd played that card in his deck. Look, I'm stretching here, but I remember Wild Guess seeing some play then.
Is this the first time that you've seen Wild Guess appear in a deck without any sort of graveyard synergy?
Yes.
Tyler Winn's just trying to fix his draw a little bit, trying to protect himself against flooding out a little bit.
For some reason, I think that maybe Jerry or Todd played Wild Guess in some sort of modern Grizzlebrand deck to bring back with Goryo's Vengeance. I think that's well within their range. Likely Jerry was tutoring for it with Muddle the Mixture or something ridiculous. I think that's the last time, maybe. Again, stretching.
Yeah, but this is the first time I think I've seen in a list where it's just all about just fixing the draw a little bit. Sometimes you're flooding out or little light on action or whatever. Go look at some new ones.
Oh, working out for him so far, sitting at 4-0 here. Both players happy. And so here's a question. If you're Wilkerson, do you put your opponent on the play?
I think it's totally reasonable in the mirror match to
I saw that standoff, and I think maybe Tyler's like, no, you're going first. I'm not sure that's actually not the case here, but I was wondering maybe drawing first is appropriate.
I think it is, to be honest with you. Especially in these lists where there's no Ash Zealot, there's no risk of getting just beaten down. I think drawing is pretty attractive.
Both players starting off with a Temple of Triumph to get game 2 underway. A Mountain and passing the turn for Wilkerson over to Winn, who will play a copy of Mutavault and pass the turn back. So maybe not double red here as a Boros Charm going to go upstairs. No reason to hold that thing. Get that out of here.
Nope. Another really important part of the mirror match just because it's the rate, of course, on it is so good.
Temple of Silence here from Wilkerson. Additional white source of mana that does allow him to scry to help cast those white cards that are on the splash. Winn going to fire off a Skullcracker. It leads me to believe if he's doing that, he probably has another copy in his hand.
More than likely.
Picks up a copy of Sacred Foundry. Going to play this untapped. A little bit risky against the old burn deck. Here's a Phoenix. And this looks like a Searing Blood. Oof.
I was not a really big fan of Tyler keeping the chain, well, of Wilkerson keeping the Chain of the Rocks on top of his deck. He got paid off there a little bit for it. Winn with actually a creature in his draw.
Going to pass the turn back over to Winn Wilkerson. Again, does have Chain of the Rocks, has a Magma Jet, a Shock as well. Going to fire off a Magma Jet on the end step here. Going to put Winn down to 9. Take a look at a couple of cards, a Phoenix and a Skullcrack are his options. I got to imagine you probably don't want the creature at all.
You definitely don't want the creature. That's part of the reason I was a little surprised that Wilkerson kept the Chain of the Rocks on the top of the deck. When he already had Searing Blood, you're in a really good position if your opponent does have Chandra's Phoenix. And you're doubling down on the downside scenario where Winn has no creatures but all burn spells. So, but the larger principle is true. The creatures in the mirror match just aren't very good. They're pretty trivial to kill, and they turn on Searing Blood.
Scry puts the top to the bottom. Here's a Magma Jet from Winn. That'll trigger his Phoenix so long as he does remember. He'll also get Scry 2 here as Wilkerson goes down to 15. You see him tap the Phoenix, saying the trigger is on the stack still. So a little Scry action here. One on top, one on bottom looks to be the choice. Phoenix go to the grip, resolve the Jet, and it's time to untap and take a draw here for Tyler Winn. See what he finds. Going to play a Mountain. That 4 mana is certainly important, representing the old War Leader's Helix.
Suspicious. Get back your Phoenix, not cast it.
To say the least, as a shock here from Wilkerson. Going to put Winn down to 7. Wilkerson draws a Mutavault for the turn. Wilkerson actually has a War Leader's Helix of his own right now. And it's all about timing with these burn spells.
Yeah, we're in the staring contest right now.
Winn going to play his Sacred Foundry tap. I think the staring contest greatly favors Tyler Wilkerson, though.
For sure. Winn being so much lower means that the pressure may be on him to start resolving soon. Although if Winn just starts making land drops, the script could actually first flip, and Wilkerson may be the one who has to cast something first.
You cast Phoenix here if you're Wilkerson? And just keep waiting?
I would probably keep waiting. You're at 15, there's no rush. And if Winn has Searing Blood here, it is a disaster for you to cast this Phoenix.
You see he's giving this a lot of thought, just passes the turn back over to Winn, who has no interest in casting a spell. Again, we know he has Chandra's Phoenix in his hand, does not have another land, so Wilkerson, I think, is just looking for a land here. Picks up a Magma Jet, which is actually a pretty good draw.
Yeah, it allows him to initiate something while still living up Skullcrack, which is a big deal here. Helps him fix his draw, too.
Lightning Strike here from Winn's going to put Wilkerson down to 12. One could argue, outside of a land, Magma Jet's like the perfect card to find.
Yes.
Winn does draw his card. We know he has a War Leader's Helix in his hand that he's trying to leave up here. Skullcrack makes that difficult, however.
Boros Charm is pretty high on the list of powerful draws for
Yeah,
Wilkerson
that's
here
true.
as well.
It's time to fire up a Jet with Skullcrack still available. Winn going to go down to 5. Wilkerson going to take a look at a couple of cards. Chain of the Rocks and a Mountain. Got to want that land.
Yeah, this allows him to cast War Leader's Helix with Skullcrack backup, which is really good here.
Now the big question is, when do you cast it?
Probably on Winn's upkeep is when I would cast this. But we also see how Wilkerson wants to proceed.
Any reason for that? Bit of an explanation for people?
So if Winn in some weird case here is able to successfully fight over all this stuff and survive, you're allowing him to use his mana on your turn and then untap with all of it available. If you do it during his upkeep, Winn essentially loses all the mana he has access to in this turn and is still dead in exactly the same way.
Sure. You see a War Leader's Helix there from Wilkerson. Will resolve, puts Winn down to 1, and now Winn knows he can never make a move because Wilkerson will just respond with a burn spell. So you do see the concession there. And we'll be going to game number 3 in the Tyler and Red-White Burn Mirror.
So that's a timing window that a lot of people don't cast spells in because it rarely comes up. But in spots like that where your opponent has mana available, they may be able to respond, but you don't want to give them more information, or you don't want to allow them to hit another land drop or something along those lines. It's often best to just cast the spell in your opponent's upkeep. Because if Winn is able to survive everything there, he has to tap out on his own turn. That opens up an opportunity for Wilkerson to say, play a Phoenix and attack with that and Mutavault, and maybe still win the game that way.
Yeah.
But if Winn is able to survive that sequence somehow, he's able to untap with all of his mana available now on his own turn. It's potentially much more dangerous that way.
Well, it's time for a third and final one between these two players. And it might be a situation here where maybe it's the player on the play who wins, or maybe it's just the player who stumbles first. As both players, each game, the player who's been on the play has won the match. Now, I don't know if that's always going to be the case here, but, the results here thus far have shown that the player who's actually gotten to go first has won.
Both players have had draws where they've had all their significant cards. In the games where one player doesn't have War Leader's Helix especially, it definitely shows. But so far, both players have had pretty good draws. All their meaningful cards, so. This is going to make the tempo of the game a little more significant.
Maybe Burn's not done yet. Again, both these players sitting here at 4-0. One of them's going to be 5-0 with the Burn deck in a 9-round tournament. You got to like where things are started and headed for each one of these players. And you got to imagine that each of these players chose this deck with a thought process of, well, Andrew Tenton's win last week in Cincinnati. Black, green, huh? I'm going to pilot this bad boy and cut those decks up.
Burn with main deck Searing Blood, not a bad choice against green splash black Devotion with main deck Lifebane Zombie.
Yeah.
That's a good metagame call.
Both these players playing decks to each other. They are ready to rock and roll. Again, Nick Miller in the sideboard has already sat down with Philip Fortner in his red-white kind of mishmash burn creature deck. That deck tech will be available on our coverage page later today. Looks like he's also going to take the time to sit down with Andrew Snyder in the mono black aggro deck as well. So some interesting and different decks this particular weekend. Cincinnati was pretty straightforward, but we're seeing some new things here in Knoxville.
It just takes people time sometimes.
Yeah.
Just issue it time.
And also, you know, the cards that are being, you know, the new cards that have come out in Journey and Nix, are just, they're really different and hard to evaluate. I mean, a card like Athreos, we've never seen anything like that before. We don't know where that goes. I mean, Mana Confluence is pretty easy because, hey, it's a land that taps for all the mana and deals us 1. We've seen City of Brass before, but, you know, a card like Farika, Master of the Feast, it's hard to figure out where to implement those cards.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of time. Not surprising that week 1, people figured out pretty quickly that, you know, you can just play Abrupt Decay in your Mono Black Devotion deck. That's not that hard to figure out, but trying to unearth the new content, the actual new spells, that's a little bit harder.
Wilkerson giving some thought on what his second land was going to be. Goes with Temple of Silence, going to scry. You see the Sacred Foundry. He had the option to play that either tapped or untapped. A lot of enticing options here. Here's a Lightning Strike from Winn. First Blood, Wilkerson goes down to 17.
I like the setup of Wilkerson's mana base quite a bit. He's playing a Temple of Silence and a Temple of Malice. I'm a big fan of temples in this list just as on general principle. And it also enables Toil Trouble in the sideboard, sort of incidentally.
Wilkerson just going to play a Sacred Foundry tap, pass the turn back over to Winn, who fires nothing off. Just going to play a Sacred Foundry tapped and pass the turn. Here's a Magma Jet from Wilkerson on Winn's end step. Winn's going to go down to 18. It's time to scry. You see Wilkerson taking a look at 2 lands, a Sacred Foundry and a Mountain.
The big problem that Wilkerson's having right now is his hand is just clawed with these useless Chain of the Rocks. They're pretty poor in the mirror match in general, and especially given the way that Winn's draws have been situated, they have done very little.
I have to imagine that Tyler probably boarded out all of his creatures. It wouldn't surprise me, at least. I mean, I don't think he has great alternatives, but at the same time, being able to leave Chain dead is pretty nice. I guess he leaves Phoenix in, probably boards Eidolon out.
Yeah, that would be my guess as well.
And Wilkerson just keeps running into multiple copies of Chain of the Rocks, which is effectively just a mulligan. Here's a Phoenix here for him, opening himself up to a card like Searing Blood, a little bit risky. It's going to be a Searing Blood. Wilkerson's going to go down to 14.
Yup. That is a tough sequence for Wilkerson.
Winn going to draw his card for the turn. This also leaves the door open for him to actually cast a Challenger's Phoenix or just do this, which is getting from Mutavault, because it's shock or bust at that point.
It's hard to find an opening for shock to be very good, or rather to hit with Mutavault in the mirror match, so taking those opportunities when they present themselves is really important. I like that attack from Winn there as well, because if Wilkerson has shock and shocks your Mutavault, that means he's not shocking you and getting back the Phoenix at the end of the turn. So shock is already bad for you to begin with.
Tapping 2 mana. There's an Eidolon, the Great Revel. We thought he might sideboard out, but actually leaving in as it's kind of interesting, right? Leaving this card in because your opponent actually has to take care of this, and for them to take care of it, they have to take 2.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's actually an interesting card to leave in. As here's 2 copies of Boros Charm in response to that. So take 8, tough guy, says Wilkerson.
Although, again, you're not even necessarily that upset if you're Tyler. This opens up an opportunity to either attack with the Mutavault or as you're seeing here, land a War Leader's Helix uncontested.
But Wilkerson draws a copy of War Leader's Helix of his own. And not only that, but that's a 4 mana spell. It actually gets around the Eidolon Claw, so he can fire that off on the Eidolon, gain 4 life, go up to 12. Doesn't mean it's reserved for the head. It's actually a pretty good draw.
Yeah, but Winn will be on 14 life, and Wilkerson will not have a lot of resources to be dealing damage with. So Winn, in my opinion, comfortably in the front foot right now.
Just another Eidolon. It is. Eidolon very interesting in this matchup. Creates this interesting tension as Wilkerson's going to go down to 10 from the attack from the Mutavault.
It's pretty sweet if you would think that your opponent's bailed on creatures altogether or come close to it.
Yeah.
Because it does require some sort of response here. It's going to be 2 damage.
Yeah, and it's going to deal 2 again. Chain of the Rocks does take care of that, but 2 damage dealt over to Wilkerson. Winn with just 2 cards left in his hand. He's going to untap. He'll take a draw. Can he close the door? He's ahead right now, but you see Wilkerson's hand right now of 3 copies of Lightning Strike. Winn going to deal 3 right now, along with another one.
And if he's tapping his Mutavault here, that means he has lethal.
And that's a shock, and that is going to do it. Tyler Winn is going to win this matchup for Tyler Wilkerson. 2-1. Red-White Burn moves on to 5-0. And we saw Winn last weekend lose to Adam Jurczyk to pick up his 2nd loss, but he had a deep run in that tournament. He's got a deep run in this one, too.
I think his setup post board is just a little bit better, a little bit leaner. Wilkerson had so many copies of Chain of the Rocks in his hand in that game. I think that he should have just bailed on those and brought in Toil Trouble. Toil Trouble's not great in the mirror match, but I think Chain of the Rocks is really unlikely to be good.
Yeah, I think the thing that's really interesting about this is that Eidolon is effectively a shock in that matchup, and it can be more than that, but it's always going to deal 2, and that's all you want the card to do.
Yeah, the only issue is that it potentially turns on Searing Bloods that are dead otherwise.
That's true.
But assuming your opponent has to use a real spell to kill it, you're pretty happy with the exchange.
We're going to be heading over to our next match for you guys in just a moment. Travis Anderson with Mono Blue Devotion versus Joe Lissette playing Blue White Control. Again, Lissette is sitting here at